All right, Joel Gausten here from joelgausten.com. For this video, I am very happy to be joined by a performer I saw back in March who absolutely blew my mind, and I've been waiting for an opportunity to speak with her ever since. It's my great pleasure to welcome Reg Bloor. Reg, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I saw you perform back in March, like I said, in Teaneck, New Jersey. You were on the bill with Doom Dogs, which is, of course, the great Reeves Gabrels, Jonathan Cain. Fantastic set. Hadn't seen or spoken to Reeves in many years, so it was cool to do that. And I was really captivated by your performance. And I picked up your latest CD that evening as well. And ever since that time, I've wanted to kind of dive into your history and your musical approach, which, I dare say is quite different than the vast majority of artists I featured on this channel. And we'll get into certainly all of those things. But really, to kind of bring things to the very beginning, you are a guitarist. When and how did music and particularly guitar first become such a major part of your life?
I started playing piano actually when I was 5 years old. Um, I did that for about 4 years, um, before my dad made me quit because he didn't want to spend the $3 a week. Cheap bastard. Um, I tried a few other instruments, tried, snare drum, cornet, never got the hang of that. Tried singing in the choir. Um, And then after my parents split up, my mother let me take guitar lessons because she thought it would piss off my dad. Um, Turned out he didn't give a shit, but whatever. So that's what I started playing guitar when I was about 12.
Excellent. And what kind of music were you taking in at that time? Who were some of your initial influences on the instrument?
Well, it was interesting. When my parents were still together, we lived in Ohio, very rural Ohio, before the internet, no cable. So, I heard more about music from all the wrong people, preachers and that sort of thing, before I actually heard very much rock music. And so when I finally started hearing it, we moved to Connecticut and got MTV. I was kind of disappointed. It was not nearly as cacophonous or satanic as I hoped it would be. Um, and but I, got into what I had access to at the time, which was mostly metal. And even when I could, hear some weirder stuff on Night Flight or whatever, I heard the Residents and couldn't find their records anywhere. At the time in the 80s. It wasn't really till I moved to Boston that I had access to experimental music.
Did you move to Boston specifically to go to Berkeley?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And how would you say that experience most impacted your playing and your philosophy towards music?
Um, Well, it's interesting. They say you need to know the rules to know how to break them. And the most insidious rules are the ones you don't know you're following. Somebody has to point out to you, that you're following them. Um, but the way they taught the rules, I kind of disagreed with because I feel like music theory is more of a history than a set of rules. And
Mm.
it's a history of broken rules. And it's always like, okay, here's the only notes you can play with this, except when it's modal interchange. Well, except when and then you come out the other side and you can play anything with anything, but you know why. And I feel like that should be taught more of a history, more as a history than as just rules.
So going in that, for want of a better description, a less lazy description, going in that sort of avant-garde direction had been an interest of yours leading to the Berkeley experience. Um, it makes me wonder because I've had a few artists on the channel who, like yourself, have built careers based on going in a different path. For example, there's a wonderful band called Toiling Midgets on the West Coast who've had decades of these fabulous albums that are very challenging and very esoteric in their approach. And everybody who's been in that band is an exceptional musician, just in principle. And it seems there's a bit of a fork in the road sometimes with musicians where even if you want to be, let's say, alternative, you can kind of go the REM route and no faulting them, they're wonderful in their own right, or you can go completely in a different direction and make things possibly difficult for you working with promoters and building a name for yourself in the industry, let's call it. Um, and I respect anybody who goes in that direction, certainly. But for you, why was it important to pursue the path you have when the other opportunities were there to do a more traditional approach to music that, may have led to different opportunities versus where you ended up going sonically?
Um, well, for me, I didn't really feel like I had opportunities. Um, I didn't, it's not like people were asking me to do pop music and I was turning them down. It's, it wasn't like that. So I just played what I like. Dissonance is what I like, switching meters a little bit, going and playing something that's sort of dissonant, sort of goofy, sort of weird is what I like, and so it wasn't like um in fact, people didn't want me to play music at all, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the 1990s, but being a female guitar player was not something that was welcome. And so I just did what I wanted because nobody wanted me to do it anyway. So I
Hmm.
fuck it, you know.
Did you find that attitude um, prevalent in Berkeley as well, or in the Boston scene, let's call it, during that time? Was that an issue for you, or was that more of kind of the experience leading up to that journey to Boston?
Um, I was kind of looking for something. It wasn't like I heard experimental music and was like, oh, I want to do that. I was looking for something that was more interesting.
Hmm.
Um, and Berkeley was kind of evenly divided between people who were doing straight jazz and people who were doing kind of straight rock. There wasn't a lot of uh, avant-garde even there. Um, but I knew it's interesting learning what the rules are. I learned where the avant-garde was because it's not here. This is the rule, so it must be out here. So um that's it's sort of an anti-influence, I guess. Um
Right. Maybe taught you what you didn't want to do versus what you
right.
wanted to do. Yeah,
I took the rules as being here's what's been done a million times and that you're already sick of. So do something else.
exactly. Was Twitcher your first group that really kind of went out there and, performed, recorded, and functioned as a proper unit?
Pretty much, yeah. I had a lot of false starts before that, but that was really the first one that was came together and worked for the time that it worked.
Yeah. So this would have been for that band mid to late 90s, or it was before.
Yeah,
Okay, mid to late 90s. One of the things that I found interesting looking into your past work with them is you have this Lloyd Kaufman connection because the band was actually in a Trauma film, which being a Jersey guy is the greatest thing ever, So how did that come about?
I grew up a Trauma fan. I grew up with the Toxic Avenger, Class of Nukem High, and um, Lloyd had put out the book, All I Need to Know About Filmmaking I Learned from the Toxic Avenger. It's a great book if you're doing anything DIY. And he did a book tour for it, and he did an appearance in Boston. And we had finished the CD, but we didn't have it printed yet, so I had a cassette of it. And I'm like, I'll give a cassette to Lloyd. He probably gets a million cassettes. He probably won't even listen to it. So I go to hand it to him. And he goes, a tape. This is traumatic. Um, Lloyd, he's very animated. And so we ended up on the soundtrack to Terra Firma, which is actually my favorite trauma movie, completely independent of the fact that I'm on the soundtrack. Um, yeah, so that was quite a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Top of the tree. Fantastic. What eventually led to Twitcher sort of winding down and you relocating to New York City at the close of the decade?
Well, it was sort of three things. The clubs in Boston were starting to close, partially because of gentrification, partially because the pendulum was starting to swing back toward dance music. Um, and I had been making trips, weekend trips down to New York to see shows at the Knitting Factory. And then two of our members graduated from college and got kicked out of their apartments. Um, and so the singer, Sandra, called me up and said that to tell me she was moving back to New Jersey. And our bass player had already moved back to Connecticut, where he was from. And so I said, let's move to New York. The drummer we had at the time was becoming less and less interested. And so we made the move. We kind of didn't survive the move, but by the time it fell apart, I had met Glenn and was working with him. So that's how it worked out.
Yeah, yeah.
The
And
bass player for that band actually ended up in the Glenn Branca Ensemble eventually.
excellent, excellent. And with Glenn, he's another person I've had a great fascination with. And I can't say I've heard all the output. I think that's a years long process.
It's a lot
Um,
of,
but I've heard quite a few things, and I've watched interviews with Glenn over the years, and certainly an interesting, fascinating person with a great perspective on a great many things. And you and Glenn eventually married, and you worked with Glenn until his passing a few years back. Um, this perhaps is the most difficult question, maybe it's the easiest one, but when you look back at this creative output that you had with him, um, what would you say is maybe the greatest moment or moments that stand out for you just from a creative perspective, but also remain meaningful to you just because you were working with your partner in realizing these things?
um, well, there are different moments for different reasons. It was incredibly varied, actually. Obviously playing at Primavera for 4,000 people and who very enthusiastic about the music, was a highlight. Playing at Walt Disney Concert Hall, which is amazing building. And just doing Symphony Number 13 for 2.5 years for 100 guitars and meeting hundreds of people, and sort of forming a community around that. Um, Symphony Number 15, which was the music for strange instruments, was particularly fun because we were going around looking in the trash for things to build instruments out of. It's incredibly fun. Um, so there's a lot of, it was incredibly varied, but there's a lot of moments for different reasons. Um, Recording Ascension, the sequel at the Power Station, which is a historic place.
Yeah, yeah, I could imagine. Um,
Working with David Bowie one time, that was uh,
Yes, I did want to get into that. Let's go there because I've had a couple of people who also share that honor in their history. But how did your paths cross?
um it was actually the first thing I worked on with Glenn. I was in New York 6 months, and it was music for an art installation by Tony Auersler. They were gonna He was gonna project Bowie's head onto four orbs. I don't know if you're familiar with Tony's work, but he does these projections onto various things. So he was projecting Bowie's face onto these orbs and reading cut up poetry that Tony had written. So Glenn did a basic track and I did sort of a guitar improv on top of that. They didn't end up using it for the installation because the budget had been cut for Expo 2000, because the year 2000 ended up being a big fart. But it still exists somewhere, and hopefully Tony will put it on at some point. But I did get to work with.
Yeah.
They used a different version of the audio with Tony doing the vocals for the but without the visuals for the actual installation.
How much of an opportunity did you have to kind of be in Bowie's creative space in that time and sort of witness that process take place?
Um, it was interesting because as soon as he walked into the room, he was telling jokes. It was like he was doing a stand-up routine. Maybe that's his way of controlling the room. Um, but Tony had to put his head, Bowie's head, in this like apparatus to hold it still,
Mm.
and then he to read the poetry. And it couldn't have been very comfortable for him, but he handled it with grace. Um, but yeah, he talked about outsider art and underground comics, and was mostly telling jokes.
So your first few months in New York City were very eventful.
Yes, yes.
And now I know at some point Systems Neutralized became the label that you and Glenn were doing together initially, right? That's how that worked. Um,
Yeah,
and
when we did Ascension the sequel, that's when initially we were just using it as a name on the records, but I'm actually in the process of making it official. Which has been a little slow going because I don't know how to do it, but I have gotten some help, and uh it's getting going.
excellent, excellent. Um, a question that just sort of came to me about Glenn. As I said, I've watched his interviews, I've listened to his music, and it seems to me that in a lot of cases, when you have an artist like Glenn who presents music that's difficult for certain people to connect the dots with, it's not like, oh, we're a pop band, we do country, we're a wedding band, we play 38 special songs, it's not very clear cut in a lot of ways. People, critics especially, have to sort of connect their own dots in a way when they take in a work like that. Um, Now that yeah, he's been gone, unfortunately, a few years now. Um, is there anything that people tend to get wrong about him? That maybe their interpretation is not really what perhaps he was aiming for with his work.
A lot of people think it was just about volume, you know, when we played through the same PAs as everybody else. It's not how sound works, you know. And um but if they enjoy the volume, then great, you know. It's the sort of thing where even if you don't get it, you can kind of appreciate it on a certain level, I think. But yeah, the assumption that it's not, that it's just about having a lot of guitars, or just about the volume, or just and not about the composition, because you know, his experiments with the harmonic series tend to get overlooked, I think.
Mm. Yeah, it never felt to me, from what I've experienced of his work, it never felt like a gimmick to me. Oh, we have 100 of this and we're doing this. I mean, that's interesting for the soundbite and the music critic opening paragraph, but it always seemed to be a lot more than that. Like there was more behind it. And I would suspect that even with the output that he was able to share, there's probably a heck of a lot more up here than ever made it onto record and ever made it onto the stage. Um,
Was constantly coming up with ideas. Like we'd be walking down the street and he'd go, "Listen to that sound. That's an idea for a piece." Or look at those people over there. That's an idea for a play. Look, that would make a great paint. Like his mind was just going all the time like that. Like his recorded output wouldn't even be like a day's worth of ideas. He was just coming up with them constantly. Um, so yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's fantastic that what made it onto record is still available. And obviously, if anyone's watching this conversation who's yet to experience Glenn's work, Take a deep dive. You'll hear things you have not heard before and will not hear anywhere else. And it was during the initial few years you were working with Glenn and with Glenn, you started your next band, which was the
The
Paranoid.
paranoid critical revolution.
That's right. Apologies. Yes, Paranoid. I always trip on that for some reason, but I've heard that material as well, and that was um, from what I've heard more of a full band approach than your later work, which we'll get into in a moment. What kind of led you to branch out and do that particular project in the format that you chose to do so?
Um, well, I always had, my own music, and playing with Glenn, we would do these big gigs just a few times a year, and there was a lot of downtime. During that time, a composer named Brian Bridges is an Irish composer, had gotten a grant from the Irish government to come to the US and go out drinking with composers. And he, a classmate of his from Trinity College, Dublin, was Libby Fab, who became my drummer, and he put me in contact with her, and we hit it off and played together for a good while. So, and she quit at one point, and then I found a singer. Trying to find a drummer, I accidentally found a singer who knew how to use a drum machine, and we did one record with that format.
Hmm.
But then he eventually quit as well. Both of them quit to do corporate jobs. But yeah, it was always my intention to have um, a four-piece rock band, but it became obvious to me that depending on other people was not something I should do. Um, so that's why I play solo.
Yeah. And you have three solo albums to date?
Yes.
Excellent. I wanted to definitely get into your most recent release, which I picked up the evening I met you, which is My Filter hopefully will cooperate somewhat. Viewer discretion is not advised. I absolutely adore this record, first and foremost. I call them records, although they're slightly smaller than that. Um, my impression of it after a few of my initial listens is this does not feel improvised to me. These sound like songs. It actually sounds like a band, although it's, you know, mostly just yourself and the compositions are, initially sound very sort of abrasive and all over the place. Before long, I realized there is structure to this material. Um,
They're structured like rock songs.
yeah, absolutely. That's definitely what it sounds like. Um, So with that said, because it's clearly a songwriting experience. These are songs. This is a collection of songs. Do you have a general process that you employ when you're writing this material? Um, so it kind of stays on the tracks that you're perceiving and it doesn't, go too far in any one particular direction?
Well, I tend to come up with the different sections one at a time, and then I just kind of piece them together the way I want to. So I usually start with a chord because I like coming up with weird dissonant chords. And then I usually have a few different variations that I can't decide between, so I end up using all of them. And then I sort of piece them together in the order that I want. So, and I want them to be little rock songs, so that's how it works out.
Excellent, excellent. There's a lot to sort of unpack with this album. The first one, obviously, if you're looking at it, is the cover artwork, and it's a very similar style to your past releases. And you did this artwork. Um, any kind of aesthetic inspiration that you use to come up with this stuff? Because it's actually pretty fantastic.
Um, well, this guy here, I have it here. This guy here, his name is Skitch, and I have been drawing him for about 30 years. Um, the covers tend to be references to horror movies. This particular one is the whole thing is a reference to Bride of Chucky, but of course,
Hmm.
as you can see, he's watching Evil Dead too, because that's my favorite movie. Um, but yeah, they tend to usually, well, this one doesn't have quite so much projectile bleeding as the other ones do, but they tend to have um splat stick, I think is the word, like horror comedy, um, very sort of Evil Dead meets Tom and Jerry meets Dead Alive, I guess. Um, kind of aesthetic.
Very cool. And this is a systems neutralizers release.
Yeah.
Uh, Number 8, it says here. And this is what I love about it is it's a homegrown CD, very much independently produced. And I miss that aesthetic so much. Obviously the 90s was kind of the apex of that, it seems. And instead of getting a download card at a show, you get something like this, which I would much rather have. Um, do you see the music you're doing now, particularly with this record, appealing to any particular scene over another? I asked that question because I could very easily see you play a metal festival and be very well accepted. And also, I can see, although I don't believe it's even around anymore, I could certainly see you play the Knitting Factory and play for that crowd as well. Do you see a kind of a particular area growing as far as the acceptance and enthusiasm for what you're doing?
The type of shows I play vary to the extreme. I just played a metal show with like brutal death metal bands. I was scheduled to play a show with improv bands. Sometimes I'm on with, oddly enough, I'm very rarely on with no wave bands, but that's where I'm coming from, no wave. But yeah, what the kind of bills I end up on vary to the extreme. And it's usually a small subset of people who from those crowds who like it. It's not like the whole crowd
Mm,
is it accepts me as being that genre. I'm always still on the fringe of a couple different scenes.
absolutely. Yeah, it makes sense. To go back to a point you made earlier, I am curious, any modern horror movies doing it for you these days? Anything recently that's been
Terrifier 2 was fantastic.
Yes, yes. I'm so happy you said that. My friend's son is the lead actor in that film.
Oh wow, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. Hello, Elliot, if you're watching. Um, yeah, that's fantastic. And of course, three's coming out soon.
Yeah, yeah, can't wait.
I don't know how they're going to top it. That was one of the greatest cinematic experiences ever. Perfect. Perfect. And I'm not usually a gore fan. I'm more of a psychological, kind of Hammer Films era slash Burnt Offerings kind of horror fan, Ghost Story. But it was so over the top and ridiculous. There's no way it can't be appreciated. It's like they really did that.
Yeah,
And the fact that it was done through crowdfunding, they made every penny work, obviously, and the kills were inventive, very
yeah,
inventive. I wish that whole team well, and the young man I know who's in the film has had this great sort of post film celebrity experience going to horror conventions now, and he's got a solo career. He does music and things. So
that's great.
um, it's been wonderful to see on a personal level that whole thing take off. But three's going to be insane.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't wait. I think it comes out around the holidays, so that may be my Christmas gift to myself. Go see Terrifier 3 alone.
Cool.
Fantastic. So we're looking at the end of summer somehow already. Um, what's in store for you the rest of the year? What are some plans you have for the remainder of 2024 musically?
At the moment, a few things are up in the air, but I'm definitely giving a talk at Florida Southwest State University in December about the harmonics guitar, and I'm going to be playing. The curator at the Bob Rauschenberg Gallery there owns some of Glenn's guitars, and I'm going to be playing at least one of them. Um, I'm gonna go down a couple days before and mess around with them and see which ones I want to play. But yeah, that should be interesting.
Excellent. Do you tour this around the country or overseas at this point, or do you keep it, generally on the East Coast?
I do whatever opportunities I have. I can't afford to self-fund it. So I have to, if I get an opportunity where I can get paid and pay for the trip, then I go where they pay me.
Fantastic. Well, I will include plenty of information in the video description on where people can find your music and reach out to you if they would like to pursue any of those opportunities. And I can't recommend the album enough. It's one of the most intriguing releases I've heard in a very long time. And I wanted to touch base with you on it and learn a bit more about your history and your approach. And I really appreciate where you're going musically, and I really look forward to what's to come. But until then, it's been a great pleasure connecting with you, and I thank you again so much for being a part of my channel.
Thank you.